The first time they saw him, it was past midnight. 3 riders coming back from the Harlow Creek trading post caught the flicker of a lantern moving slow through the tree line on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Valley. They reined in and watched. The light stopped, dropped low to the ground, rose again, moved 20 feet, dropped again. Whatever the man was doing, he was doing it alone, in the dark, and he did not stop when he heard their horses. That was Callum Briggs, and what he was dragging was stone. Flat shale, specifically. Thin layered plates that broke clean along the grain when struck right. He had them loaded on a wooden sled rigged from 2 pine poles and a strip of rawhide. His hands had gone from burning to numb hours ago. The lantern threw 6 feet of orange light in every direction. Beyond that, Montana was black and absolute. Dolan Ferris, who ran cattle on the neighboring claim, squinted through the cold. "That is the Scotsman," he said. "What is he dragging?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. Callum Briggs was 31 years old, lean the way men go, lean in cold country. Not from hunger, but from years of hard labor, stripping everything soft away. He had filed his homestead claim 6 weeks earlier on 160 acres at the base of the Bitterroot Range in Montana Territory. It was October of 1879. He had come west from Aberdeen by way of Pennsylvania, where he spent 4 years laying foundation stone for a mining company that asked him to cut corners on a shaft entrance he knew would fail. 3 months after he refused and walked away, it collapsed. 2 men died. Yet Callum heard about it in a Pittsburgh boarding house, said nothing to anyone, and started west. He carried 2 things from Aberdeen that no customs man ever recorded. The first was the memory of his grandfather Ewan's hands, thick, cracked hands that could read stone the way other men read print. The second was the shape of Ewan's house on the Aberdeenshire coast. A low, dark structure that looked from a distance like the hill had simply grown a door. Its roof began at the ridge and descended in a single unbroken slope all the way down to within inches of the earth on 3 sides. Ewan had built it that way because his father had built it that way, going back generations, to a time when the North Atlantic wind was the primary thing trying to kill you. But Callum had watched that house survive storms that stripped slates off every other roof in the parish. He had also watched neighbors in Pennsylvania burn through 8 cords of wood in a single winter, heating timber boxes they had built without one thought given to wind or mass or the cold that comes in low and horizontal at 3 in the morning. He had decided, before he ever saw Montana, exactly what he was going to build. His neighbors around Harlow Creek had a different picture in mind. There were 11 other claims within 4 miles. The Coombs brothers from Ohio, who between them had built 6 frontier cabins. Tench Hollowell, a former Army quartermaster who had supervised construction at 3 forts along the Platte. Dolan Ferris himself, who had framed and raised his own bunkhouse, main house, and 2 outbuildings over 5 years. These were experienced men. They knew timber, they knew weather, and they knew what a proper structure looked like. What Callum was building did not look like that. His walls on the north, east, and west faces stood only 5 feet high. His roof descended from an 11-foot ridge all the way down to the ground on 3 sides. From 50 yards away, the finished structure looked less like a cabin than like a low ridge someone had cut a door into. Tench Hollowell rode over, looked at it for a long minute, and said what every man in the valley had already been saying out loud. "That roof will trap moisture, rot your timber, and sit inside the snowpack by February. Snow loads will shear the whole north face clean off. I have seen it happen to stronger frames than this. Callum drove a peg and said, "The snow is part of the design." Hollowell stared. "What does that mean?" "It means I need it there," Callum said, and went back to work. He moved in on November 3rd. 2 weeks later, the first hard freeze hit the valley. 14 below zero, Fahrenheit, before dawn. Not the worst Montana could produce, but enough to press down on every structure at once and show exactly what held and what did not. What happened next, nobody in that valley was prepared for. The Coombs brothers felt it first. Garrett woke at 2 in the morning with his breath fogging thick above his face and the fire reduced to cold ash. The temperature inside their cabin had dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. He could feel the floor through his wool socks, a deep, penetrating cold rising straight up through the raised timber platform, like the ground itself was exhaling ice. Lyle was already awake, sitting up in his blankets, feeding split pine into the stove with hands that shook slightly. They burned through 4 logs before the interior climbed back to 50 degrees. Then they fed it again. Then again. By dawn, they had burned through nearly a full cord in a single night. Tench Hollowell's situation was worse. His cabin was well built by every standard he knew. Tight walls, steep roof, proper eave height. But the wind had found the north face and was pressing against it the way a man leans into a door he intends to open. Hollowell could hear it working at the gaps between logs, and a thin, persistent whistle that dropped the interior temperature 2 degrees every hour, regardless of how hard he fed the stove. He hung a wool blanket across the north wall. It helped for an hour. Then the cold soaked through that too. By mid-morning of the second day, Dolan Ferris rode the creek road checking on his neighbors. He stopped at each cabin, noted the smoke volume from each chimney, noted the faces of the men inside. Everyone was burning hard. Everyone was tired. Everyone had that particular drawn look that comes from spending a night managing a fire instead of sleeping. Then he rode past Callum's structure. The chimney was producing a thread of smoke so thin it was almost invisible against the white sky. Ferris stopped his horse. He sat there for a full minute. A thread of smoke meant a small fire, and a small fire in 14 below zero meant either the man inside was frozen stiff or something else entirely was happening. He dismounted, walked to the south-facing door, and knocked. Callum opened it in his shirt sleeves. Ferris stared. The air pushing out through the doorway was warm. Not stove hot. Not the aggressive baking heat of a room where a man has been burning wood at maximum rate all night. Just warm. Steady and even, the way a root cellar stays cool in summer without any ice at all. "Come in if you want," Callum said. Ferris stepped inside. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly. The cast-iron box stove held a modest fire. 3 small logs, nothing more. The stone floor under his boots was not cold. The walls showed no frost. The air near the floor was within a few degrees of the air at head height. A detail so contrary to every cabin Ferris had ever stood in that it took him a moment to identify what felt wrong. In every conventional cabin he knew, floor air was brutally cold. You kept your feet up. You wore 2 pairs of socks. The heat stratified, burning hot near the ceiling, near useless at ground level. Here the temperature was simply even. Calm. Like the cold outside was a rumor rather than a fact. "How?" Ferris said. It was less a question than a sound a man makes when arithmetic stops working. Callum poured 2 cups of black tea from the Dutch oven and handed one across. "My grandfather built the same way," he said. "The earth under that floor has been absorbing heat since October. It does not cool quickly. The roof above us weighs close to 1,000 pounds per section. Stone, clay, sod, and now 2 feet of snow on top of that. The heat does not pass through that mass in one night. It takes days. So the cold outside and the warmth inside, they never truly meet." Ferris looked up at the low ceiling. The roof that everyone had called a catastrophe waiting to happen was performing as a slow, massive barrier between the living space and the Montana winter. The snow load that Hollowell had predicted would shear the frame apart was instead sitting on top of a foot of compacted sod, held in place by the gentle slope, adding its own insulation to every layer beneath it. The wind that was destroying Hollowell's north wall had nothing to push against here. 3 sides of the structure rose 5 feet and then angled away at a slope. There was no vertical face, no broad, flat wall to receive the full force of a 40-mile-per-hour gust. And the wind moved up and over the way. Water moves over a flat stone in a creek, fast, uninterrupted, leaving the stone itself undisturbed. Ferris drank his tea and did not say anything for a while. By the end of that week, the valley had its numbers. The Coombs brothers had burned 2.5 cords in 7 days. Hollowell had burned 3. Ferris himself had burned just under 2. Callum Briggs had burned less than half a cord and had slept through every night without once rising to feed the stove. Word moved fast on the frontier. It always does when the news costs a man his pride. Robert McKendrick was the last man to come around, and he came the hardest. He was the most experienced builder in the valley, and that experience sat on him like armor. He had framed and raised structures across 4 territories, and he had studied load distribution, timber grading, foundation prep. He was not a man who changed his mind easily, because his mind had been right too many times to surrender without a fight. But February broke him. He had burned through 9 cords of wood since November. His interior walls showed frost lines on the north face every morning, a thin white crust that melted by midday and left the logs damp. His wife had developed a persistent cough from the smoke. His water bucket froze solid 18 inches from the stove on the worst nights. He was exhausted, irritable, and running his fuel calculations with a dread he refused to show anyone. He rode to Callum's on a Tuesday morning with a measuring tape, a pencil, and a notebook. Callum let him in without a word. McKendrick spent 2 hours measuring everything. Floor temperature, wall temperature, air temperature at knee height, chest height, ceiling height. He measured the roof pitch, the sod thickness, the depth of the stone floor. He wrote everything down in his tight, careful hand and did not speak while he worked. Callum sat on his 3-legged stool and sharpened a knife and let the man work. When McKendrick finally closed the notebook, he stood by the stove and looked at the numbers he had written. Floor temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest height, 63 degrees. Ceiling, 66. A gradient of 8 degrees from floor to ceiling. In his own cabin, that same gradient ran from 39 degrees at floor level to 71 near the ceiling. 32 degrees of difference. Dead cold at your feet, scorching above your head. And the stove consuming wood at a rate that would strip the surrounding hillside bare before April. He tapped the notebook against his palm. Then he said, "Walk me through it. All of it. From the foundation up." Callum set down the knife. He talked for 20 minutes. He explained the compressed stone and clay floor and how it absorbed heat slowly over weeks and released it the same way, never spiking, never crashing. He explained the roof mass and how 1,000 pounds of sod and stone slowed heat transfer the way a thick wool coat slows it, not by blocking cold entirely, but by making it work for every inch. He explained the low profile on 3 sides, how the wind that punished every vertical wall in the valley simply had no surface to punish here. He explained the snow and how 2 feet of accumulated snowpack on a sod roof added insulation that a conventional steep roof shed into the yard and wasted entirely. McKendrick listened without interrupting. When Callum finished, the builder was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandfather figured all this out." "His grandfather figured out what worked," Callum said, "and his grandfather before that. Nobody sat down with a pencil and calculated it. They just watched what survived and built it again." That was the thing that settled into McKendrick deepest, not the physics, though the physics were undeniable. It was the idea that a design could be sophisticated precisely because it was old. That centuries of cold winters and dead livestock and frozen families had already run every experiment worth running. And what remained standing after all that testing was not primitive. It was proven. He rebuilt his north wall that spring with a 3-foot earth berm packed against the outside face. He dropped his eave height on the north and east sides and extended the roof slope downward. He added 4 inches of sod over his existing shingle course. It was not Callum's design. It was his own design, rebuilt around Callum's principles. By the following November, he was burning 30% less wood and sleeping through the night. The Coombs brothers modified their second cabin the same season. Tench Hollowell bermed 2 sides of his structure and reported the difference immediately. Dolan Ferris, whose cattle operation gave him resources the others lacked, had commissioned a full rebuild on Callum's plan and had it framed before the first frost of 1880. Within 3 years, 7 structures in the Harlow Creek Valley showed the influence of what neighbors had once called the Scotsman's burial mound. None were exact copies. Men adapted the principles to their materials, their budgets, their existing frames. But the common thread ran through all of them. Low profiles, roof mass, earth contact. The understanding that winter was not an enemy to be defeated with enough firewood. It was a force to be shaped around. Callum Briggs sold his claim in 1883 and moved further north into the Bitterroot Range. He left behind a structure that stood without significant repair for another 2 decades, outlasting most of the conventional cabins built around the same time, and the men who had laughed at his midnight stone hauling, who had predicted his roof would shear apart under its first snow load, who had counted his 5-foot walls as evidence of ignorance, did not talk much about those predictions afterward. What they talked about instead was heat, about fuel, about the specific sound a cabin makes when the wind finds nothing to grab and moves on, about sleeping through a Montana night without rising once to feed a fire that was already dying. Callum's grandfather, Ewan, had known all of it. He had known it the way men know things that have cost their family members their lives to learn. He had simply passed it forward, the way useful truth tends to travel, quietly, through hands and memory, waiting for the right cold night to prove itself again. If Callum's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. When Callum opened that door in his shirt sleeves, 14 below zero outside, and barely burning a stick of wood, and Dolan Ferris stood there with his mouth open in the cold, what did that moment say to you about what old knowledge is actually worth. Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.